Welcome to our latest video, where we delve into the harsh realities of corruption that plague nations worldwide. In 2025, corruption continues to be a global challenge, crippling economies, deepening inequality, and hindering development. Today, we'll take you on an eye-opening journey through the top 10 most corrupt countries in the world. These nations are grappling with issues like bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, and the misuse of public funds, which have devastating consequences for their citizens. From political scandals to resource mismanagement and broken institutions, these countries highlight the urgent need for transparency, accountability, and reform. Let's uncover the stories behind the headlines and understand how corruption affects millions of lives. Stay tuned as we count down to the most corrupt country of 2025. 10. Eritrea. Eritrea's authoritarian government has created an environment where corruption thrives, fueled by a lack of transparency and accountability. Public officials often demand bribes, and the tightly controlled economy leaves little room for independent oversight. Citizens frequently face extortion and favoritism in their interactions with government institutions. The regime's repressive policies silence dissent, making it impossible to address corruption effectively. Resources meant for public welfare are often diverted to benefit the ruling elite, exacerbating poverty and inequality. Eritrea's isolation from the international community has further entrenched corruption, leaving its population with limited opportunities for development and progress. 9. Haiti. Haiti's chronic political instability and weak governance have made it one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Public officials are often accused of embezzling foreign aid and public funds, leaving critical infrastructure projects incomplete. Citizens frequently encounter bribery in their interactions with government services, exacerbating inequality and poverty. The mismanagement of resources has hindered development efforts and left Haiti heavily reliant on international aid. Corruption within the judicial system further undermines the rule of law, making it difficult to hold officials accountable. The lack of transparency and oversight has perpetuated a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment, with ordinary citizens bearing the brunt of these challenges. 8. Libya. Libya's political fragmentation and ongoing conflict have made corruption a pervasive issue across all sectors. Rival factions and militias control different regions, engaging in bribery, extortion, and smuggling. The country's vast oil wealth, which should be a source of prosperity, is often misappropriated by elites and armed groups. Public institutions are weak and riddled with corruption, with officials frequently accused of embezzling funds and mismanaging resources. This has left ordinary citizens struggling with poverty, unemployment, and a lack of basic services. The absence of transparency and accountability has made it difficult to implement reforms or rebuild the nation's infrastructure. 7. Yemen. Yemen's protracted conflict has created a fertile ground for corruption, with resources frequently diverted by government officials, armed groups, and local power brokers. Public services are almost non-existent, and citizens often have to pay bribes to access basic necessities. International aid, meant to address humanitarian crises, is frequently misappropriated, failing to reach the most vulnerable populations. Corruption within Yemen's public institutions has undermined efforts to rebuild the country and establish peace. The absence of a strong central government and the influence of rival factions have further complicated efforts to combat corruption, leaving the population to bear the brunt of poverty, insecurity, and a lack of services. 6. North Korea. In North Korea, corruption is deeply ingrained in the fabric of society, driven by the regime's strict control over the economy and resources. Bribery is a survival mechanism for many citizens, who must pay officials to access basic necessities such as food, healthcare, and travel permits. The government's opaque policies and lack of transparency have created a black market economy where officials profit from smuggling and illicit trade. High-ranking officials often engage in embezzlement and nepotism, consolidating wealth and power within a small elite. The authoritarian regime's repressive policies make it impossible to address corruption, as dissent is brutally silenced and accountability mechanisms are non-existent. This pervasive corruption has further isolated North Korea from the international community, exacerbating the suffering of its population. 5. Venezuela. Venezuela's economic and political turmoil is compounded by endemic corruption that has permeated all levels of governance. The government's mismanagement of the country's vast oil resources has led to widespread poverty and economic collapse. High-ranking officials are frequently accused of nepotism, cronyism, and embezzlement, diverting public funds for personal enrichment. Public services, including healthcare, education, and transportation, are in a state of disrepair due to corruption and mismanagement. Citizens often resort to paying bribes to access basic services, further exacerbating inequality. Law enforcement and judicial systems are equally compromised, with officials known to accept bribes and facilitate illegal activities. The lack of transparency and accountability has eroded public trust, making it difficult to implement meaningful reforms. 4. Afghanistan. Despite decades of international intervention, Afghanistan remains one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Corruption is pervasive across all sectors of governance, with public officials demanding bribes for basic services and permits. The judiciary and law enforcement are particularly corrupt, with cases often influenced by money and political connections. International aid, which has poured into the country for years, is frequently misused or embezzled by officials, undermining development efforts. The Taliban's resurgence has added another layer of corruption, as they control illicit trade networks and levy taxes on local populations. The culture of impunity, combined with weak institutions, has made it nearly impossible to hold corrupt officials accountable, perpetuating cycles of poverty and insecurity. 3. Syria. The civil war in Syria has not only devastated the country but also entrenched a culture of corruption that permeates every level of governance. Public officials and military personnel engage in bribery, embezzlement, and black market activities, exploiting the ongoing conflict for personal gain. Access to essential services, such as healthcare and education, often requires bribes, leaving the most vulnerable populations at a disadvantage. The war economy has created opportunities for powerful elites to profit from smuggling, arms trade, and the diversion of humanitarian aid. Corruption extends to the distribution of international aid, with resources often siphoned off before reaching those in need. The lack of accountability and transparency within the government has further eroded trust, making it difficult to implement reforms or rebuild the country's infrastructure. 2. South Sudan. South Sudan, one of the world's youngest nations, has struggled with corruption since its independence in 2011. Political conflicts and a lack of strong institutions have made corruption rampant, particularly in the management of the country's oil resources. High-ranking officials have been accused of embezzling billions of dollars, diverting funds meant for infrastructure, healthcare, and education. This systemic corruption has deepened poverty and fueled ongoing conflicts, as rival factions vie for control over resources. Public service delivery is crippled, with citizens often required to pay bribes for access to basic services. The absence of effective legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms has allowed corruption to thrive unchecked, undermining efforts to build a stable and prosperous nation. International aid, meant to alleviate humanitarian crises, is frequently misappropriated, further eroding public trust in the government. 1. Somalia. Somalia remains one of the most corrupt countries in the world, plagued by decades of political instability, clan rivalries, and a lack of centralized authority. Corruption in Somalia is deeply entrenched, with bribery, mismanagement, and misuse of resources affecting nearly every sector of governance. Public officials often siphon off foreign aid intended to address poverty and humanitarian crises, leaving ordinary citizens without basic necessities. The judicial system is equally compromised, with cases often influenced by bribes and favoritism, undermining the rule of law. Clan-based politics exacerbate corruption as leaders prioritize their own clans over national interests, leading to unequal distribution of resources and services. The lack of transparency and accountability further fuels the cycle of corruption, leaving Somalia's population vulnerable to poverty, insecurity, and limited access to education and healthcare.